Okay, so our second part of the lesson is going to take a look at Aboriginals and the environment. We'll start with that. And really it's talking more about how Aboriginals are trying to preserve their environment and preserve their land in the reserves against uh, government development or private corporations trying to develop onto it. We see that this is still an issue today. So this is, even though this is back in 2012, you guys have probably heard of Enbridge and their Northern Gateway pipeline, still trying to build it through BC, so it's been an issue for a while. And here's a little news report about it. I'll read it out to you. It says, if approved, Enbridge would negotiate for access to the lands along the route, about 80% of which is provincial Crown land. Much of the line would also run through territory claimed by First Nations groups, who are promising both legal obstacles and physical blockades. Merle Alexander, a Vancouver-based lawyer who specializes in Aboriginal law, equated the process to a chess match. It's essentially going to be a legal war of attrition, he said. The company said it has been negotiating with First Nations groups for years, but if Enbridge could not find an agreement with Aboriginal leaders, the federal government would have the authority to expropriate, a murky proposition when balancing the rights of Aboriginals. So what they mean here by expropriate is if you go back to the Indian Act, it says that the federal government has the right to take land away from the Aboriginals for this kind of infrastructure. So it's almost like the Aboriginals don't even have any power in this issue, really. If the government sides with Enbridge and they want Enbridge to build this pipeline, they can actually take the land away and allow Enbridge to build the pipelines. And the Aboriginals, under law, can't really do anything about it. It says, first of all, the leadership in these bands have convinced themselves that they own this land rather than that they have claim to it, says Mr. Flanagan, who has written widely on First Nations issues. According to law, it's crystal clear that the government has the right to authorize projects with payments of compensation for any damage to the value of the claimed land. So same thing that I just mentioned, that the federal government still kind of has the power to take the land away if they really want to. Enbridge has a constitutional obligation to consult Native groups affected by the pipeline, but what defines consultation, whether that means providing information, promises of collaboration, or obtaining consent, remains untried. In other words, by law, any company who wants to build through Aboriginal lands have to consult with the Aboriginal group. But what consultation means is vague. There's no clear definition of what that is. It could mean giving them like a pamphlet saying here's all the information, and then they could say that's consultation is done. It doesn't necessarily have to require any kind of discussion. So you can see how a lot of the power is kind of taken away from the First Nations groups in terms of the Indian Act itself taking powers away and laws around consultation being not very clear. This issue is not new. Aboriginals have been fighting against development on their lands for a long time. Here's an example back in the 70s where a company is trying to build, again, a pipeline that goes from Alberta to Alaska. So it's almost the exact same thing again. This is the Berger Commission that you're going to see in the video here in a sec. But it's going to be the Dene group where this pipeline, their land, where the pipeline goes through. And they pretty much want to put a stop to this. The Berger Commission, by the way, in the kind of studied the environmental impacts of the pipeline on the land and took a look at what proper compensation to Aboriginals would be. In the end, kind of with delays and delays and delays, and I believe by that time the project became too expensive for the company to build anyway, that the pipeline doesn't get built. But here's, we'll watch a bit of this clip about the Berger Commission and how the Dene are responding to this commission.
We know that our grandchildren will speak a language that is their heritage. We know they will share their wealth and not hoard it or keep it to themselves. We know they will look after their old people and respect them for their wisdom. We know they will look after this land and protect it, and that 500 years from now, someone with skin my color and moccasins on his feet will climb up the ramparts and rest and look over the river and feel that he too has a place in the universe. And he will thank the same spirits that I thank, that his ancestors have looked after his land well, and he will be proud to be a Dene. It is for this unborn child, Mr. Berger, that my nation will stop the pipeline. It is so that this unborn child can know the freedom of this land that I am willing to lay down my life.
Okay, so you can clearly see they're opposed to this, and in the commission or in the investigation, they're pretty much voicing their concerns. So the issue came up earlier on of Aboriginals wanting self-government as a solution to getting rid of the India Act, and with self-government also comes possibly the issue of claiming land. So we'll talk about the continuation of land claims in the post-World War II era. We do have to take a look at the Charter of Rights and Freedoms first, because in 1982 we actually protected the Aboriginals' rights to claim land, or to negotiate with Canada to claim land. We'll point you to, this is section 25 of our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and if you take a look at 25A, it says any rights or freedoms, so in other words, Canada can't take away any rights or freedoms that have been recognized by the Royal Proclamation of October 7th, 1763. For those who forgot that from Socials 9, that was when Britain was fighting against France, 7 Years' War, and then there's no more New France at the end of it. The Aboriginals at that time were also kind of involved in this war, and so what Britain wanted to do is pretty much appease them at the time, because they didn't want to continue fighting with Aboriginals now that France is defeated. So they pretty much gave them the right in the Royal Proclamation to negotiate treaties with the British government. So that right is now protected in our Charter of Rights and Freedoms today. So in 1985, some gains are made towards Aboriginal self-government. 1985 amendments or changes to the Indian Act are made. One thing it does is gives more powers to Aboriginals to regulate which band members and other individuals could reside on reserves, could live on reserves. Bands can also have more power over development on reserve lands, so building malls, building casinos, whatever else. They have more powers to kind of develop their lands and to build things on it. Bill C-31 in 1985 also is the amendment that allows Aboriginals to gain access to post-secondary education and get compensated for it. So there's monetary assistance given to Aboriginals for going to post-secondary institutions. It also gives Aboriginals extra health care. So aside from the same health care that everybody else gets, they get services through Health and Welfare Canada. Okay, so at least the first two here are kind of trying to give more power to Aboriginals in terms of self-government. When it comes to land claims, there are two types of land claims. There are comprehensive land claims and specific land claims. In BC, the issue is more based around comprehensive land claims, where Aboriginals in BC are pretty much saying all the land in BC had never officially been turned over to the British. If you go back to Socials 10 and you think about the numbered treaties, so treaties number 1 to 7, that John A. Macdonald made with the Aboriginals in the prairies, those were done. That's a treaty. There was official transfer of lands from Aboriginals to Canada. But in BC, none of those treaties have ever been made. So it was almost just the assumption that, from the British perspective, that all the land was theirs. So currently, there are Aboriginal groups trying to make claims to negotiate a treaty with BC or with Canada to have some sort of official recognition of the transfer of the land. Aboriginals say they have every right to do this because it's protected under the Proclamation of 1763. They can do this since no other treaty was made before. There are people who argue against this, saying that if you go all the way back to 1763, when Britain made that clause in the proclamation, BC was unknown to them at the time, so it couldn't have been included in that deal of allowing the Aboriginals to make treaties with the government, since to them the land didn't exist. But Aboriginals, of course, will be trying to make some sort of treaty deal with the government, and currently, if you take a look at this map, it's a map of First Nations whose statements of intent to negotiate a treaty have been accepted. So here's all the different First Nations groups who are planning to create some sort of treaty with the government, and so these are in the process of being done. And that's as of 1994. There has been some successes with the Nisga'a in BC. The Nisga'a, if you look at the map on the right, are just north of where Prince Rupert is. The Nisga'a have officially created a treaty with the government, and to officially recognize the land kind of being turned over. The Nisga'a were given compensation, $190 million. They only got 8% of the land that they were asking for. They had the right to a municipal government. That's similar to what most reserves get anyway. Policing is similar to that. Fisheries and hydroelectricity development, they had the right to that on their land as well. One thing they had to give up, though, is being tax exempt on land, and this is talking about sales tax. And so most people assume you go to different reserves and you don't have to pay sales tax if you're status Aboriginal, but the Nisga'a gave that right up in their deal with the government. In 1998, the Supreme Court made it a little easier for Aboriginals to claim land by saying you don't necessarily need historical records or documents to claim it. You just need usually archaeological evidence that proves continuous occupation of the land, and that is good enough to file a claim. Outside of BC, there's been success as well. In Nunavut, the creation of Nunavut in 1999. So the talks began in the 60s. So this is actually a very old issue. The claim itself was presented to the government in 1976, and it's not until 1992 that agreement was reached, and they have to take that agreement, bring it back to the Inuit who live in the area and see if they want it. 85% of Inuit endorsed it and were okay with it. So part of the agreement is that $1.1 billion will be paid out to the Inuit people for turning over the land to Canada officially. They will get 1.9 million square kilometers of land and water kind of reserved for them. They also get mineral rights. And finally, the division was made in 1999, and that's when we get Nunavut. The Oka confrontation is a little different. This is all the way close to Montreal. So if you look at the map here, here's Montreal, and it says there's the Kanesatake Reserve here. These are the Mohawk. And it's not really a land claim, but the Mohawk or the Kanesatake would have had their land there. They have the reserve there. And what happens with this issue is that there's a golf course in 1990 that's trying to expand. They believed that that was their land, and they started to expand onto Mohawk territory. So Mohawk, of course, tried to stop the construction of this, and they set up a barricade. The police are then sent in to try to stop the Aboriginals and get them to leave. Tear gas was used to try to get the Aboriginals to disperse. There was actually gunfire, and one police officer, I believe, was shot. The police tried to create barricades to stop the Aboriginals, but eventually the Aboriginals or the Mohawks drove the police back. Right? And we're going to travel back in time to 1990. And here's the news.
All this because of a dispute over a piece of forest the Indians claim is theirs. A forest town council wants to bulldoze to expand the local golf course. Just a quick look now at the lay of the land. There's the present golf course on the right. The forest that would be chopped down for more golf is on the upper left. The Indians have blocked off both ends of the road leading to that forest. Tonight, it's a standoff, the situation very tense. Our coverage of the day's tragic events begins with Neil MacDonald.
The Quebec Police Force SWAT team moved in at dawn, trying to enforce the court order despite the provincial government's stated sympathy for the Indians of Oka. And if ever a police operation was to go tragically wrong, it was this one. Police used gas, then bullets, but they weren't prepared for what met them. Dozens of heavily armed Mohawk men determined to hold what they say is their sacred ground. There were women and children behind the barricades when the attack started, and that only added to the Mohawk rage. After 15 minutes of mayhem, during which their own tear gas apparently blew back at them, the police retreated as abruptly as they'd attacked, leaving behind their cruisers. They also left a heavy front-end loader, which the Mohawks immediately put to their own use. The police cruisers, crushed and useless, became barricades themselves, and one other was given a new paint job before being pressed into Mohawk service. 31-year-old SWAT team member, Marcel Lemay, was shot in the mouth and died later in the day. Indian leaders behind these barricades say Lemay was shot accidentally by one of his own fellow officers. They say they heard that on police radios confiscated from these wrecked cruisers. In any event, they say the police started the gun battle in the first place. The Mohawks say they stuck to their policy of not shooting until fired upon. After the police retreated, the warriors celebrated, but it didn't last long. They went back to the barricades later in the afternoon, standing guard over the golf club whose expansion plan started all this in the first place. Traditionalist Mohawks met all day inside the encampment, and at the end of the day they remained resolute.
We treat these trees and the land like our mother. These people are raping our mother. What would you do if they raped your mother?
This evening, Mohawk leaders said they received a call from Quebec's Indian Affairs Minister, John Chacha. They say Chacha asked to meet them and promised that if negotiations begin, the Quebec police force will remain at bay in the town of Oka. He also promised helicopter surveillance will cease. The Mohawk leaders say they have no choice but to believe him. Neil MacDonald, CBC News, Oka. Instead of moving on the Oka barricades by road, the Army chose the terrain it likes best, the forest, moving in from behind, coming in the back way. When they rolled, it was swift. The warriors met them on a dirt road deep inside the Indian territory.
We gonna start swinging or else tell these fuckers where to go. Come on! Come on! Fuck! Come on!
The infantry major in charge made it clear he was heading for the barricades at any cost and that bullets would be met with bullets. As soon as I'm able to move forward, I move forward. Are you moving right through to the barricades? There's a barricade down there? Yes, sir. I've taken 3 barricades now. The warriors were nearing hysteria at the sight of soldiers near their tribal cemetery.
Somebody give me fucking permission to slug that fucking guy. Get back! Get back! Hey!
Then something remarkable. Mohawk women assumed command and cleared their men.
Get back, stay back, I'll fucking kick your ass.
Run! Shoot! Shoot!
Fucker! Get him out of here! Shoot! Hey! Come on! Come on! Hey! Hey! Come on, then!
The warriors calmed down, although not much, and they took to taunting the soldiers face to face.
I must be number 1 on your list, or you're number 1 on my list, too.
A bit nervous, perhaps? You think? You nervous? Should be. Motherfuckers.
But the Mohawk threats and rifles had little effect on the soldiers. They continued to advance relentlessly throughout the day, and by evening they were here in the very center of the Ganasatagi encampment. They were at the edge of the sacred Mohawk cemetery and near the very spot where the Quebec police officer was killed weeks ago. They were also within about a 1-minute march from the main Indian barricade.
Restez calme, bougez pas, pointez pas l'arme.
And the soldiers followed the methods they'd followed all along, telling the Mohawks not to shoot first or they would shoot back. By nightfall, it was an almost ghostly scene, soldiers behind barbed wire and searchlights digging in for the night, with the promise that they won't move at least until morning. Neil MacDonald, CBC News, Oka.
Okay, so as you saw there, the army was eventually sent in to deal with this. Other Aboriginal groups across Canada put up their own blockades to show support, just blocking roads. The protests escalates and eventually the army is sent in, as you saw. The other protest support kind of comes to terms with the government, and so they kind of stop their support, and they try to persuade the Kanesatake Mohawks to lay down their arms and to end this blockade. So that's how it all kind of comes to an end. To resolve the issue, the golf course was canceled. Mohawks were arrested that kind of stood up to the army or were shooting against the police. As you saw already, one police officer said SWAT team member was killed. Federal government, to kind of put an end to all this, purchased the land from the municipality and then officially gives it over to the Kanesatake Mohawks. So not a treaty negotiation as we've seen in all of the other instances, but still giving them the rights to the land in the end. But you can see how tense it got between the Aboriginals and the federal government with their army and the police in Quebec as well. Last thing to mention is a Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples that was done between 1991 and 1996 to take a look at how do you solve the issue, that you've seen some of that anger that exists between Aboriginals and the Canadian government. What do we do to solve it? Recommendation that comes from it, very general, that the relationship between Aboriginals and the government needs to be fixed somehow. In history, it's always been Aboriginals against Canadians, and really what needs to happen is they need to start working together, is what this commission finds. So we'll see how that turns out. So the key question for all this is, how well has Canada performed in dealing with Aboriginal rights in its quest to create a just or fair society? So hopefully, if you can kind of think back to the main points or the main topics that we talked about with the white paper, the issue of Aboriginal education, stopping the residential schools, but still more problems created from that. The environmental concerns that Aboriginals have and how Canada starts to develop, the amendments to the Indian Act, some groups getting official treaty rights and making deals with the Canadian government, and finally with that Oka confrontation, has Canada been acting like they are trying to create a just or fair society? Giving you some pages to review here from the textbook as well. Hope that all makes sense.